Did you know that in one American town it's actually illegal to fall asleep in your own cheese factory? That's right. If you doze off while the cheddar is curing, you might just wake up to a fine. And that's just one of the unbelievable legal oddities that exist right here in the United States. Welcome to a journey through the most bizarre, head-scratching, and downright ridiculous laws ever put on the books. These aren't just obscure footnotes in history, they're real regulations that, in some cases, could still land an unsuspecting citizen in hot water today. It's almost impossible not to wonder, how did these laws come to exist in the first place? What was happening in that town council meeting when someone stood up and seriously proposed making it illegal to eat an orange in your bathtub or to fish while sitting on a giraffe's back? These aren't just silly rules, they're tiny, peculiar windows into the fears, priorities, and sometimes the sheer creativity of communities across the nation. Each law tells a story, and more often than not, it's a story that makes you shake your head and ask, wait, really? You're about to uncover 30 of the most absurd laws passed in US history, from the oddly specific to the flat-out perplexing. We'll travel state by state, era by era, exploring the strange logic or total lack thereof behind regulations that banned everything from whistling underwater to attaching a firework to a hat. So get ready to laugh, gasp, and maybe even feel a little relieved that you've never accidentally broken one of these rules yourself. This is one ride through American legal history you won't forget. Our first stop on this tour of the absurd takes us to the sun-scorched deserts of Arizona, where the law explicitly forbids any donkey from catching some Z's in a bathtub. You might picture a farmer's wife walking into the bathroom to find her husband's prized Jenny curled up in the porcelain tub, and honestly, you wouldn't be far off from the probable origin story. While the exact minutes of that fateful town council meeting are lost to time, the most widely accepted theory points to a single, peculiar event in the early 20th century. A local rancher, perhaps as a prank or out of sheer desperation on a hot day, reportedly placed his donkey inside a large, livestock watering tub to cool it down. The animal, finding the experience rather pleasant, decided to lay down for a nap, effectively blocking access to the water and creating a minor ranchyard crisis. This seemingly isolated bit of rural mischief was apparently concerning enough for lawmakers to take action. They may have argued it was a matter of public safety or animal welfare, perhaps concerned a sleeping donkey could injure itself or that a bathtub might not be the most hygienic place for a large animal. The real motivation, however, was likely rooted in a very specific type of frustration, the frustration of coming home after a long day of hard labor, only to find your primary means of getting water is occupied by a snoozing pack animal. This law is a perfect example of legislation born from one incredibly strange complaint. It's not about a widespread epidemic of bathtub-loving donkeys. It's about that one guy and his one donkey that caused that one big problem one time. From the bizarre animal antics of Arizona, we head to the heart of the Deep South, where Alabama lawmakers took a firm stand against frivolous facial hair. In this state, it is explicitly illegal to wear a fake mustache that causes laughter in a church. You have to appreciate the specificity of it. It's not merely the wearing of the mustache that's prohibited, but the act of wearing one that successfully elicits a chuckle from the congregation. This law is a fascinating, if heavy-handed, attempt to legislate human emotion and maintain absolute solemnity within a place of worship. It suggests a scenario where a stern deacon, trying to focus on his sermon, is constantly scanning the pews not for souls in need of saving, but for suspiciously luxurious and comedically angled upper lip hair. The origin of such a peculiar statute almost certainly lies in a single, memorable act of disruption. Picture a Sunday service in a small town at the turn of the 20th century, a scene of quiet reverence suddenly shattered by a young man arriving with an enormous handlebar mustache made of wool or wax. The initial gasps would quickly turn to stifled giggles, then to full-bodied, echoing laughter, completely derailing the solemn proceedings. This wasn't just a prank, it was an assault on the decorum of the entire community. The law's very existence implies that this happened more than once, or that the one time it did happen, it left such a powerful impression on the town's elders that they felt compelled to ensure it could never happen again. What makes this law truly absurd, however, is its breathtaking subjectivity. Humor is one of the most personal and variable human experiences. What reduces one person to tears of laughter might leave another completely stone-faced. This statute places the weight of the law on the unpredictable reaction of a crowd. A modest, subtly fake mustache might go entirely unnoticed, while a truly outrageous one could cause a minor riot. The wearer's fate wouldn't hinge on their intent, but on the comedic sensibilities of the parishioners around them. It raises a host of unanswerable legal questions. How many people need to laugh for it to be illegal? Is a snort considered a laugh? What if someone laughs out of nervousness rather than humor? It's a law that attempts to pin down a fleeting, subjective reaction with the blunt force of legal code, and in doing so, it reveals a deep-seated desire to control not just actions, but the very atmosphere of a community space. Leaving the quiet solemnity of the Alabama church, we arrive in the vibrant, unpredictable state of Florida, where the legal system has a very specific plan for your pachyderm parking needs. Yes, in the Sunshine State, the law clearly states that if an elephant is tied to a parking meter, its owner is obligated to deposit coins into that meter, just as if it were a standard automobile. This isn't some whimsical piece of modern satire. It's a genuine statute that speaks directly to a unique and largely forgotten chapter of American entertainment history. To understand how such a law came to be, you have to travel back to the early and mid-20th century, an era when massive traveling circuses were a major form of national entertainment. These enormous operations would roll into town on trains, unloading a literal parade of wonders that included clowns, acrobats, and most importantly, exotic animals. Florida, with its warm climate and extensive railroad networks, was a frequent winter home and a key touring stop for many of these shows. Picture the scene: a massive circus arrives in a small Florida town. The streets are packed with spectators, vendors, and performers. The elephants, being the star attractions, are essential for everything from putting up the big top to leading the grand parade. But what does a circus handler do with a multi-ton animal when it's not performing? They have to secure it somewhere. This is where the parking meter enters our truly bizarre historical vignette. A resourceful, or perhaps just exhausted circus worker, faced with a lack of proper hitching posts and needing a quick, sturdy anchor point, likely looped a rope around the nearest immovable object, a metal parking meter. To a local law enforcement officer, this presented a novel and perplexing problem. The primary purpose of a parking meter is to regulate the use of a public space for vehicle storage, ensuring a turnover of spots for commerce. An elephant, while certainly not a car, was absolutely occupying that same valuable piece of public real estate. It was blocking other potential users, and from a purely logistical standpoint, it was parked. The local government was potentially losing revenue every minute that large gray beast was camped out there for free. The genius of this Florida law lies in its bizarrely logical extension of existing traffic code. Lawmakers didn't ban the practice outright, which would have been an affront to the powerful circus industry. Instead, they applied a beautifully simple, almost comical form of bureaucratic equality. The statute effectively argues that the use of public space is the use of public space, regardless of whether your mode of transport has 4 wheels or 4 legs. It doesn't matter if it's a Ford sedan or a 4-ton Asian elephant. If it's tied to the meter, you feed the meter. This created a wonderfully surreal form of legal parity between man and beast, or more accurately, between machine and mammal. It was a practical, if utterly strange, solution to a problem nobody knew they needed to solve until a parade of elephants came to town. This next law takes us to California, a state often on the cutting edge of technology, and shows us a moment when lawmakers were so far ahead of the curve they actually ended up miles behind it. The statute in question declares with a perfectly straight face that no vehicle without a driver may exceed 60 miles per hour. At first glance, this seems like the most pointless piece of legislation ever written. Of course, a car without a driver can't break the speed limit. It can't do anything at all. But to dismiss it as mere bureaucratic folly is to miss its true genius. This law is a beautiful, almost poetic relic from a time when the concept of a self-propelled vehicle was so terrifying and foreign that the government felt compelled to state the obvious, just in case the obvious decided to stop being obvious. To truly appreciate the absurdity, we have to rewind to the earliest days of the automotive age. The year was 1925. The American love affair with the car was still in its passionate, chaotic infancy. Roads were often little more than dirt paths, traffic laws were a patchwork of local ordinances, and the machines themselves were seen by many as unpredictable, noisy mechanical beasts. In this era of rapid and disorienting change, public fears ran high. Newspapers were filled with sensational stories of runaway vehicles whose brakes had failed or whose drivers had somehow been thrown from their seats, leaving a multi-ton hunk of metal careening down a public thoroughfare with no one at the wheel. These stories, while rare, captured the public's imagination and fueled a deep-seated anxiety about this new technology. It was in this climate of fear and futuristic speculation that California's lawmakers drafted their vehicle code. They weren't just thinking about the cars of 1925, they were trying to peer into a future they could barely conceive of. The idea of a car that could propel itself without human intervention wasn't just science fiction, it was a genuine societal fear. What if a vehicle broke loose from a tow truck? What if a parked car on a hill somehow slipped its brake and began rolling downhill, gathering speed? The 60-mile-per-hour limit wasn't chosen at random. At the time, that was an almost unimaginable velocity, a speed reserved for race cars and airplanes. By placing a cap on the maximum speed of an out-of-control vehicle, the law was attempting to legislate chaos itself. It was an effort to impose a shred of order on the terrifying hypotheticals that kept civic planners awake at night. The breathtaking redundancy of the law is precisely what makes it so profound. It's a monument to a very human impulse, the desire to control the unknown through the power of rules. The lawmakers of the past weren't stupid. They were attempting to solve a problem that hadn't even fully materialized yet. They were building a legal fence around a technological phantom, trying to assure a nervous public that even in the worst-case scenario, a driverless, runaway car, there was a limit to how badly things could go. They were preparing for a world of autonomous vehicles nearly a century before the first prototype would ever hit a test track. In that sense, the law is less of a joke and more of a time capsule, preserving a moment of wide-eyed, slightly frightened optimism about a future we are only just now beginning to live in. It stands as a hilarious and humbling reminder that even our most forward-thinking guesses about tomorrow can look incredibly silly from the vantage point of today. Our journey through the legislative absurd now takes a sharp turn from the physical world into the abstract, landing us squarely in the realm of mathematics. In the state of Indiana, the value of the mathematical constant pi, known to most of the world as approximately 3.14, was very nearly legally set to a clean, simple, and utterly incorrect number, 4. This wasn't a joke or a piece of satirical performance art. It was the central goal of a genuine piece of legislation known as the Indiana Pi Bill of 1897, a monument to human confidence triumphing over mathematical fact. The story begins not with a politician, but with a physician and amateur mathematician named Dr. Edwin J. Goodwin, convinced he had achieved a monumental breakthrough. Dr. Goodwin believed he had successfully squared the circle, an ancient geometric problem that had stumped scholars for millennia, which involves constructing a square with the exact same area as a given circle using only a compass and a straight edge. Mathematicians had long since proven this feat was impossible due to the transcendental nature of pi, but Dr. Goodwin was undeterred. He was so certain of his discovery that he wanted to copyright his new mathematical truth and then generously allow the state of Indiana to use it free of charge in its textbooks. His method, however, was built upon a series of fundamental errors in geometric reasoning. He essentially started with his desired conclusion, a simpler value for pi, and then worked backward, constructing a flawed proof that inevitably led him to the number 4. In his mind, he hadn't just solved a puzzle, he had corrected a centuries-old mistake. Eager to see his brilliance recognized, Dr. Goodwin found a willing ally in State Representative Taylor I. Record, who agreed to introduce the proposal as House Bill number 246. The bill's language was a masterpiece of obfuscation, filled with dense, technical-sounding jargon that masked its mathematical nonsense. It made grand claims about the ratio of the diameter and circumference, and offered up a new set of rules entirely inconsistent with Euclidean geometry. To the untrained eye of a state legislator more accustomed to debating road appropriations and tax codes, it looked impressively complex and authoritative. The bill sailed through the House on a unanimous vote, its passage fueled by a combination of political courtesy, a desire to avoid looking foolish by questioning something they didn't understand, and perhaps a bit of state pride at the prospect of an Indiana man making a historic contribution to science. The entire endeavor was only saved from becoming official state law by a combination of sheer luck and the vigilance of a single individual. As the bill moved to the state Senate for final approval, it happened to be visited by Professor C. A. Waldo of Purdue University. A genuine mathematician, Professor Waldo was initially just observing the legislative process as a curious citizen. But as the senators, evidently proud of their work, showed him the advanced mathematical bill they were about to pass, he immediately recognized it for what it was, complete and total gibberish. He spent the rest of the day urgently buttonholing senators in the corridors, patiently explaining the bill's catastrophic errors and the international ridicule Indiana would face if it became law. His impromptu math lesson worked. Embarrassed by the revelation, the senators indefinitely postponed the bill during its second reading, letting it die a quiet death in committee. The Indiana Pi Bill stands as perhaps the most perfect example of a government attempting to legislate objective, verifiable fact. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of expertise being dismissed in favor of charismatic but misguided amateurism, and a hilarious reminder that a convincing presentation can sometimes almost triumph over undeniable truth. It proves that no field, not even the pure logic of mathematics, is safe from the reach of a determined lawmaker with a bad idea and a persuasive friend in the State House. Leaving behind the mathematical misadventures of Indiana, we find ourselves on the open highways of Utah, where the law takes a surprisingly democratic approach to traffic management. Here, the official statute grants our feathered friends an extraordinary privilege. Birds always have the right of way. That's right. If you're cruising down a Utah interstate and a seagull decides to waddle across the center lane, the law is on its side. You, the driver of a 2-ton vehicle, are legally obligated to yield. This isn't some minor ordinance from a bird sanctuary town. It's a statewide rule that elevates the travel plans of a pigeon to the same legal status as a pedestrian in a crosswalk. To understand why such a law exists, we have to picture a very different Utah of the past. In the early to mid-20th century, the state's vast, open landscapes were even more critical habitats for native and migratory birds. Highways were newer, cutting through these ancient flyways and foraging grounds, creating a novel and deadly obstacle for avian populations. A single collision with a vehicle could be catastrophic for a large bird, and for a driver, hitting a sizable hawk or goose could easily result in a shattered windshield, a damaged hood, or even a loss of control leading to a serious accident. The law was likely born from a very practical, dual-purpose concern to protect both the state's wildlife and the property and safety of its motorists. The logic behind the statute is a fascinating example of preemptive legislation. Lawmakers probably weren't reacting to an epidemic of birds jaywalking. They were anticipating a problem inherent in the collision between a rapidly expanding human infrastructure and the immutable patterns of the natural world. By giving birds the legal right-of-way, the law essentially places the burden of responsibility entirely on the driver, the party with the greater ability to control the situation. It's a recognition that a bird operates on instinct, not traffic law, and therefore cannot be held accountable for failing to look both ways before crossing. Contrast this with modern road safety priorities, which are almost exclusively human-centric. Today's traffic engineering is obsessed with flow, efficiency, and minimizing collision times between vehicles. Our systems of stoplights, yield signs, and right-of-way rules are a complex language designed for machines operated by people. A bird doesn't factor into this equation. A modern traffic planner would never suggest installing a crosswalk for crows or a stop sign for sparrows. The Utah law, therefore, feels like a quaint relic from a time when our relationship with the natural world was more directly acknowledged in our legal codes. It's a small, symbolic nod to the fact that we built our roads through their home, and with that intrusion comes a degree of responsibility. Yet, the sheer impossibility of enforcing this law is what pushes it into the realm of the absurd. How does one determine if a driver truly failed to yield to a bird? Would a traffic court accept the testimony of other birds as eyewitnesses? The statute exists more as a philosophical statement than a practical regulation, a charming reminder that the world does not belong solely to humans and our machines. It suggests a humility that is often missing from our modern infrastructure, a legal whisper from the past urging us to remember that we share the road, even with those who travel by wing. Next, we venture into the heartland of Ohio, where lawmakers took a stand against a very specific type of aquatic partying. In this state, it is explicitly illegal to get a fish drunk. Let that sink in for a moment. The statute isn't concerned with general animal intoxication. It zooms in with laser focus on the act of deliberately inebriating our finned friends. This law is so bizarrely specific that it immediately conjures a scenario straight out of a surreal comedy sketch. A shadowy figure leaning over a home aquarium with a tiny eyedropper full of whiskey, trying to persuade a goldfish to take just one more shot. The most plausible origin story for this statute points directly toward the world of live bait and competitive fishing. In the early 20th century, it was rumored that some less than scrupulous anglers would engage in a practice called fish doping. The theory went that by soaking live bait, like minnows or small worms, in alcohol or ether, the fish would become disoriented, lethargic, or more attractive to larger predator fish. A drunk baitfish might not swim as erratically, making it an easier, slower target for a hungry bass or pike. Some even believed the scent of the alcohol itself could act as an attractant. This law, then, was likely drafted as a very peculiar form of anti-cheating legislation, an attempt to preserve the integrity of the sport by ensuring every angler was on a level playing field and every fish was competing with a clear head. Beyond fair play, the legislation reveals a surprisingly early concern for animal welfare, albeit in an incredibly narrow and unusual way. While modern animal cruelty laws are broad and comprehensive, this Ohio statute is a primitive, hyper-specific precursor. It targets a form of abuse that most people would never have even considered, effectively banning the act of forcing an animal to consume a substance that alters its natural state for human amusement or gain. The punishment for such a crime is as fascinating to ponder as the crime itself. Would a judge sentence someone to community service cleaning fish tanks, order them to attend meetings of Fin-aholics Anonymous? The law's existence forces us to imagine an entire legal framework built around the sobriety of aquatic life, a system where the testimony of a drunken guppy would never hold up in a court of law. It stands as a monument to the human capacity to imagine new forms of mischief and the government's equally creative, if slightly heavy-handed, desire to stop them before the first drop of gin ever hits the water. This particular Kansas statute presents a fascinating legal puzzle because on its face, it seems to outlaw a practice that isn't just common in other parts of the country, but is a celebrated cultural tradition. The act of catching fish with your bare hands is known by many names, but in the American South and Midwest, it's most famously called noodling. This isn't a subtle, delicate art. It's a full-contact sport where individuals wade into murky rivers, reach into underwater holes and crevices, and attempt to grab massive catfish, often weighing 50 pounds or more, by the mouth. It's a practice steeped in regional pride, a test of courage and strength that's been passed down through generations. So why would Kansas, a state with its own share of rural traditions, explicitly ban it? The answer lies not in a disdain for tradition, but in a very specific and proactive approach to wildlife conservation and fishery management. Unlike some of the more whimsical laws we've explored, this one is almost certainly grounded in serious biological concerns. The primary target of noodlers is the flathead catfish, a large predatory species that plays a crucial role in the ecosystem of a river. Fisheries biologists argue that the practice of noodling can be highly disruptive. These large catfish are typically targeted during their spawning season in the early summer, when they are most vulnerable because they are guarding their nests in those very same underwater holes and hollows. By pulling a large, breeding age fish from its nest, noodlers aren't just catching one fish, they are potentially wiping out an entire generation of offspring that would have hatched under its protection. This selective pressure on the largest, most successful breeders can have a significant negative impact on the overall health and population stability of the species in a given waterway. Kansas lawmakers, advised by their state's Department of Wildlife and Parks, likely saw a blanket ban on all-hand fishing as the most straightforward method of preventing this ecological pressure. Their goal was to maintain a balanced, sustainable fishery for all anglers, not just the subset engaged in this one particular method. It's a classic case of the government prioritizing the long-term health of a natural resource over a specific cultural activity. This puts Kansas in direct opposition to states like Oklahoma and Louisiana, where noodling is not only legal but regulated with specific seasons and permits, representing a completely different philosophical approach to managing the same tradition. There's also a powerful element of public safety woven into this law. Noodling is an inherently dangerous activity. Reaching blindly into an underwater cavity isn't just risking a nasty bite from a fish with a powerful jaw. It's risking a confrontation with whatever else might call that hole home. Beavers, snakes, turtles, and even muskrats are all common occupants of the same structures sought by noodlers, and an unexpected encounter can lead to serious injury. By making the practice illegal, the state of Kansas is also effectively insulating itself from potential liability and avoiding the need to deploy emergency services for noodling-related accidents. It's a law that protects both the citizens and the catfish, even if it means outlawing a practice that in other states is a rite of passage. Now we mosey on down to Kentucky, where the legal system has taken a firm stance against a very particular fashion choice, carrying an ice cream cone in your back pocket. This isn't some random act of legislative whimsy. It's a law steeped in the gritty, practical realities of 19th century rural life, specifically the rampant and costly problem of horse theft. To understand why a law would target such a bizarrely specific behavior, you have to picture the scene. In an era before cars, a horse wasn't just a pet or a luxury. It was a family's primary means of transportation, a vital asset for working the land, and often the difference between prosperity and ruin. A stolen horse could cripple a family. This is where the ice cream cone enters the story as an unlikely tool of crime. The most widely accepted theory suggests that cunning horse thieves would use the sweet treat as a clever, scent-based lure. They would place a melting ice cream cone in their back pocket and then casually stroll through a town or amble past a farm. A horse, with its powerful sense of smell and well-known sweet tooth, would catch the enticing aroma of sugar and cream. Naturally curious, the horse would follow the scent, basically walking itself right up to the thief, who would then have a much easier time leading it away without any noisy struggle or force. It was a diabolically simple and quiet method of equine abduction, turning the animal's own instincts against it. The law prohibiting this practice was therefore not about the ice cream itself, but about removing a key tool from a thief's arsenal. By making it illegal to possess the lure in the specific location used for the crime, the back pocket, law enforcement gained a powerful, proactive tool. They could stop and question someone seen with a cone in their pocket, not for the act of theft itself, which they had to catch them in, but for the clear intent suggested by their preparation. It was a way to prevent the crime before the horse ever left the barn, so to speak. This law is a brilliant example of pragmatic, problem-solving legislation, targeting the method rather than just the outcome. It recognized that to stop a clever criminal, you sometimes have to outlaw their clever trick, no matter how silly that trick might look written down in a law book centuries later. Of course, we can't discuss bizarre laws without a healthy dose of legislative sarcasm, and Massachusetts provides a truly world-class example. In the Bay State, the law explicitly states that dueling is perfectly legal, but only if both participants are already deceased. On its face, this is a textbook paradox, a logical absurdity that seems ripped from the pages of a Lewis Carroll story. You can't have a duel without living participants. A sword fight between two skeletons is the stuff of pirate folklore, not a court of law. So why would a state legislature, presumably composed of serious individuals, bother to pass a statute that describes an impossible event? The answer is a brilliant piece of legal performance art, a way to kill a bad law with humor rather than a simple repeal. To understand the joke, we have to travel back to the 18th and early 19th centuries, when dueling was a very real and very deadly practice among gentlemen, politicians, and military officers. It was an entrenched, if illegal, method of settling disputes over honor. These weren't just spontaneous brawls, they were formal affairs with seconds, specific rules of engagement, and a complex code of conduct. Despite being banned, the practice persisted because the social stigma of refusing a challenge was often seen as worse than the legal consequences. States like Massachusetts had strict anti-dueling laws on the books, but they were difficult to enforce and often ignored. The laws were a serious attempt to curb a serious problem, but they existed in a constant tension with a stubborn social custom. The dead men dueling law almost certainly wasn't meant to be taken literally. Instead, it reads as the legislative equivalent of an eye roll, a final, exasperated gesture from lawmakers who were tired of the entire farce of dueling. By the time this law was written, dueling had largely fallen out of favor in the Northeast. Public opinion had turned against it, seeing it as a barbaric and wasteful practice. The old laws were still there, but they were becoming obsolete. Rather than just deleting the statute, some witty legislator likely proposed this amendment as a form of symbolic mockery. It was a way to hollow out the old law, to render it utterly meaningless and ridiculous without actually removing it from the legal code. It's the government equivalent of putting a "kick me" sign on a bully's back. It strips the subject of its power through ridicule. This approach to lawmaking is incredibly rare, which is what makes this statute so special. Legislatures typically communicate in dry, unambiguous language to avoid exactly this kind of confusion. But here, a lawmaker chose satire as their weapon. The statute sends a crystal-clear message. This practice is so foolish, so utterly beneath us, that we will only permit it under circumstances that can never occur. We are not even granting it the dignity of a serious repeal. It's a declaration that the era of dueling is not just over, but so far in the past that its participants might as well be ghosts. The law stands as a monument to a very specific type of New England wit, dry, intelligent, and delivered with a perfectly straight face. It proves that even in the staid halls of government, there's occasionally room for a joke, especially one that kills two outdated birds with one brilliantly absurd stone. Our journey through America's most peculiar statutes now lands us in the land of 10,000 lakes, where Minnesota law takes a definitive stand against a specific type of interstate waterfowl transportation. That's right, in this state, it's a felony to cross the state line with a duck on your head. This isn't a minor infraction, it's a serious crime on par with much more conventional offenses. The sheer specificity of this law is what makes it so captivating. It doesn't outlaw wearing a chicken, a goose, or even a particularly large trout on your head. It singles out the duck. Why? One can only imagine the series of events so outrageous, so disruptive, that it prompted lawmakers to draft legislation targeting this exact feathered scenario. The most compelling theory isn't about fashion or a simple prank gone too far. It points directly toward the lucrative and shadowy world of animal smuggling. Minnesota is a major flyway for migratory birds, home to prized species like the magnificent mallard or the canvasback. Decades ago, before modern wildlife regulations were as robust, there was a thriving black market for live birds, either for private collections, exotic pets, or for release in private hunting preserves outside the state. A conservation officer at a state border crossing would be trained to inspect trunks, cargo holds, and cages, but who would think to inspect a person's head? A live duck, especially a sedated one, could be concealed quite effectively under a large hat or hood, with only a few feathers peeking out to give it away. The law cleverly shuts down this potential loophole by making the act of transporting the duck in this manner the crime itself, regardless of the smuggler's final intent. It's a brilliantly bizarre piece of legal foresight. Of course, we can't entirely dismiss the possibility of a more whimsical origin. Perhaps this was the legislative response to a single, unforgettable individual, a Minnesota eccentric who, for reasons known only to them, developed a profound personal attachment to a particular duck and insisted on taking it everywhere, including on trips to neighboring Wisconsin or the Dakotas. One can picture the scene at a sleepy border town, a highway patrol officer doing a double take as a car slowly rolls past, the driver peering out from under the webbed feet and placid gaze of a duck perched serenely atop his head. The resulting traffic stop, the confused explanations, the bewildered police report, it might have been enough of a public nuisance that the state felt compelled to act, ensuring that no other citizen would have to share the road with such a distracting spectacle. The true beauty of this law, however, lies in its breathtaking lack of ambiguity. There are no loopholes for the size of the duck, the breed of the duck, or whether the duck is a willing participant. The statute draws a line in the sand, or rather, a line at the state border, and dares anyone to cross it with unauthorized avian headwear. It raises a host of fascinating legal questions that we can only hope have never been tested in a court of law. What constitutes a head? Would a toupee made of duck feathers be a violation? If the duck is deceased and taxidermied, is it still a duck for the purposes of the law, or is it now considered a hat? The law's enforcement, one suspects, is nearly impossible to imagine. It exists as a monument to a problem that either was so singular it required a nuclear legal option, or as a testament to a lawmaker's incredible imagination in anticipating a crime the rest of the world would never dream of committing. It stands as a perfect, feathery symbol of the strange and very specific fears etched into the legal DNA of this nation. Moving from misplaced waterfowl to misplaced desert transport, Nevada state law draws a very clear line in the sand. You cannot ride a camel on the highway. At first, this seems like the most unnecessary statute ever written, a solution in search of a problem that could never possibly occur. But this law is no random joke. It's a direct and literal hangover from one of the most fantastical and ultimately failed experiments in American military history. To understand why such a specific rule exists, we have to travel back to the arid landscapes of the 1850s when the U.S. government seriously considered replacing the horse with the camel as the primary beast of burden in the Southwest. This bizarre chapter began with a pressing national security concern. Following the Mexican-American War, the United States acquired vast new territories in the desert Southwest. The U.S. Army was tasked with establishing forts and patrolling these harsh, sun-scorched regions, but they were struggling mightily. Their horses and mules were dying of thirst and exhaustion trying to haul heavy supply wagons across the unforgiving terrain. Enter Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, the future President of the Confederacy. Intrigued by accounts of camels' legendary endurance from abroad, Davis became a passionate advocate for a camel corps. He convinced Congress to appropriate $30,000, a massive sum at the time, to import camels from the Middle East and North Africa to test their utility for military logistics. Thus began the Great American Camel Experiment. In 1856, a U.S. Navy ship arrived in Indianola, Texas, carrying a cargo that must have seemed utterly alien. 33 camels, along with several Arab and Turkish handlers hired to manage them. The animals were then marched to Camp Verde, Texas, which became the headquarters for this strange new unit. The initial results were, by many accounts, a stunning success. The camels proved to be everything Davis had hoped for. They could carry vastly heavier loads, up to 1,200 pounds than a mule, travel more than 30 miles a day without water, and thrive on the sparse, thorny desert brush that other animals refused to eat. They were used to survey a route for a transcontinental railroad and to haul supplies to remote frontier forts, often amazing and terrifying local settlers and Native Americans who had never seen such a creature. So why aren't there wild camels roaming the deserts of Arizona today? The experiment ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own strangeness and the outbreak of the Civil War. The camels simply freaked out the Army's more traditional soldiers. They were temperamental, emitted terrifying guttural groans, and their peculiar smell spooked the cavalry horses and mules. Soldiers, set in their ways, never bonded with the animals and found their unique kneeling-to-load process frustrating. When the Civil War began, the Confederate Army briefly took control of Camp Verde and its camel herd, but they had no more use for them than the Union did. The experiment was abandoned, and the camels were mostly sold off at auction to circuses, mines, and freight companies, while others were simply turned loose to fend for themselves in the wild. This is where our Nevada law finally comes into play. For decades afterward, sightings of feral camels in the desert Southwest were not uncommon. Furthermore, the few camels that were still owned and used for freight or show were a genuine, if rare, sight on public roads. A Nevada lawmaker in the early 20th century, perhaps after a report of a camel causing a traffic incident or simply as a proactive measure, needed to update the state's vehicle code. The existing laws covered horses, mules, and emerging automobiles, but they were silent on the legal status of a dromedary. The statute banning camels from the highway was a piece of brilliant bureaucratic completeness. It was the government officially closing the file on the camel experiment, declaring that this particular chapter of American history was over and that these animals, relics of a forgotten past, had no place on the modern paved highway. It's a law that serves as a tiny, legal tombstone for one of the most wonderfully weird and ambitious ideas the U.S. military ever tried. While Nevada was busy banning camels from its modern roadways, the state of New Jersey took aim at a far more abstract and personal form of expression, the human frown. Specifically, state law makes it a crime to direct a frown toward a police officer. This statute immediately plunges us into the murky waters of trying to legislate emotion and respect, a concept often unofficially referred to as contempt of cop. The very idea sounds like something from a dystopian novel where facial expressions are policed as vigorously as actions. It's not a law against threatening behavior or obstructing justice, which are concrete and definable offenses. It's a law against a subtle downturn of the corners of the mouth, a universal signal of displeasure, sadness, or simple thoughtfulness that the state has deemed illegal when observed by a member of its law enforcement. The impulse behind such a law is fascinating to unpack. On one level, it represents a breathtaking overreach by the government into the realm of pure thought and feeling. A frown is not an action, it's a reflex, an involuntary emotional response. Legislating it is an attempt to control not just what people do, but how they feel and how they non-verbally communicate those feelings in the presence of authority. The underlying message is that a police officer is entitled not just to lawful compliance, but to a display of positive emotional regard from the public. It seeks to criminalize a lack of deference, making it illegal to simply look unhappy or disapproving when interacting with the law. This creates a scenario where a person having the worst day of their life, perhaps on their way to identify a loved one or having just lost their job, could be slapped with a fine for failing to arrange their facial features into an acceptable, neutral, or cheerful mask for an officer's benefit. Unsurprisingly, this New Jersey statute crashes headfirst into the bedrock principles of the First Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court has consistently held that nonverbal, symbolic expression is protected speech. From wearing black armbands to protest a war to burning an American flag, the court has recognized that communication isn't limited to spoken words. A frown is arguably one of the most basic and powerful forms of symbolic speech. It is a silent, immediate broadcast of dissent, disapproval, or distress. To outlaw it in the presence of a government official is to establish a shocking government orthodoxy of approved emotions, a clear violation of the right to free expression. A law requiring cheerfulness is just as constitutionally suspect as a law requiring silence. Both compel a specific type of state-approved expression and suppress an individual's authentic reaction. The practical enforceability of this law is virtually zero, and it likely exists on the books as more of a legal threat than a practical tool. How would one even prove such a violation in court? Would the prosecution enter into evidence a photograph of the defendant's face, time-stamped at the moment of the alleged infraction? Would the arresting officer be required to testify under oath about the precise angle of the suspect's lips and the depth of the furrow in their brow? The subjective nature of a frown makes the law utterly unworkable. What one officer might interpret as a disrespectful scowl, another might see as a person squinting into the sun or concentrating on remembering their license and registration. The law grants an individual officer the power to arrest someone based entirely on a subjective interpretation of their mood, a power that is ripe for abuse and discriminatory application. It effectively turns a bad mood into a criminal offense, but only if a police officer decides to take offense. Ultimately, this law is less about actually arresting frowning citizens and more about sending a symbolic message. It stands as a monument to a desire for absolute, unquestioned authority, a warning from the state that even your most subtle and involuntary expressions of discontent can be deemed unlawful. It's a psychological tool, a remnant of a time when the power dynamic between the public and the police was expected to be one of total submission. While it's almost certain that any attempt to actually enforce this statute would be laughed out of a higher court, its continued presence on the books is a curious and slightly chilling reminder of the lengths to which some lawmakers have gone to try and mandate respect, one forced smile at a time. But our next stop presents a far more subjective legal challenge, one that strikes at the very heart of artistic expression. In North Carolina, the law takes a remarkably bold stance on musical talent, or the lack thereof, by making it illegal to sing off-key. This isn't a prohibition on loud or disruptive noise in general. It's a statute that plunges directly into the treacherous waters of aesthetic judgment, drawing a legal line between what is musically acceptable and what is a prosecutable offense. It immediately raises the question, in a court of law, who gets to be the final arbiter of perfect pitch? The origins of this law are almost certainly rooted in the broader and far more common legal concept of public nuisance ordinances. Every town has rules against disturbing the peace, whether it's with overly loud parties, blaring car horns late at night, or other forms of raucous behavior. These laws are designed to protect the collective right to quiet enjoyment of one's home and community. The North Carolina statute, however, represents a fascinating and incredibly specific evolution of that idea. It suggests a scenario where mere volume wasn't the primary concern, but rather the specific, grating quality of the sound being produced. One can imagine a particularly tone-deaf individual, perhaps a passionate but utterly unskilled shower singer, who decided to take their performance to the front porch, causing such a unique and sustained form of auditory distress that their neighbors felt the existing noise laws were insufficient. The law essentially argues that a bad note held for long enough can be just as disruptive as a jackhammer. This leads us to the monumental problem of enforcement, a challenge that makes prosecuting a duck smuggler seem straightforward. How would a police officer trained to detect crime, not musical cadence, be expected to make an arrest for this violation? They would need to possess near-perfect pitch themselves to confidently determine that the suspect's rendition of a classic tune had strayed from the accepted tonal center. Would they carry a tuning fork or a small electronic pitch pipe as standard issue? The courtroom procedure would be even more surreal. The prosecution's entire case would hinge on proving, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant's vocal performance was objectively and verifiably off-key. They might call expert witnesses to the stand, a music professor from the local university or the choir director from a church, to testify against the accused singer. The defense could counter with their own musical expert to argue that the defendant was simply employing a rare microtonal scale or engaging in a free-form jazz interpretation. The entire trial would devolve into a debate over musical theory, leaving a jury of 12 non-musicians utterly bewildered. The penalty for such a crime is another area ripe for absurdity. Would the sentence be commensurate with the severity of the musical crime? A single flat note might warrant a small fine, while a completely dissonant, meandering aria could lead to jail time. Perhaps the court would order mandatory vocal lessons as a form of musical community service, forcing the offender to hone their craft until they could perform a perfectly pitched scale for the judge. The law, in its attempt to quantify the unquantifiable, creates a world where your freedom could theoretically depend on your ability to carry a tune, a notion that is as terrifying to the musically challenged as it is hilarious to everyone else. It stands as a monument to the human desire for order, even in the most chaotic and subjective realms of human experience, proving that no aspect of life is truly safe from the reach of a determined lawmaker with a sensitive ear. From the melodious missteps of North Carolina, we venture into the heartland, where Oklahoma law protects its canine citizens from a very specific type of psychological assault. It is illegal to make an ugly face at a dog. This statute moves beyond the physical to legislate a form of emotional cruelty, suggesting that a well-timed grimace can inflict genuine distress upon a pooch. It's a law that immediately begs the question of intent versus interpretation. Did the lawmaker envision a world of malicious individuals dedicating their time to pulling grotesque expressions at unsuspecting poodles? Or is this a bizarre extension of the state's animal welfare codes, attempting to shield animals from all forms of human nastiness, even the purely visual? The concept of animal emotional well-being is a relatively modern pillar of animal cruelty law, which traditionally focused on preventing physical harm, neglect, and starvation. This Oklahoma statute, however, lunges headlong into the subjective realm of animal psychology. It operates on the assumption that a dog can not only recognize a human facial expression as ugly, but can also be emotionally harmed by it. This implies a fascinating, if scientifically dubious, level of canine sophistication in interpreting human social cues. A dog might understand a smile or a frown in the context of tone of voice and body language, but could it truly be offended by a crossed-eyed, tongue-out face? The law elevates the dog to the status of a discerning art critic, capable of taking aesthetic umbrage at a human's contorted features. Enforcing this law would be a logistical and legal nightmare of truly absurd proportions. The entire case would hinge on a series of unanswerable questions, beginning with the most basic: what exactly is an ugly face? Is it a universal standard, or does it vary by breed? Would a face that terrifies a Chihuahua be merely amusing to a stoic Mastiff? The prosecution would bear the impossible burden of proving, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant's expression was not just funny, strange, or neutral, but objectively and categorically ugly. They would likely need to enter into evidence photographic documentation of the offending face and then call expert witnesses, perhaps a canine behaviorist or a veterinarian, to testify to its ugliness and its likely traumatic effect on the animal in question. The courtroom scene this law invites is nothing short of surreal. Picture a stern district attorney holding up a large photograph of the defendant making a bizarre face, asking a jury of 12 ordinary citizens to solemnly agree that it meets the legal definition of ugly. The defense attorney could counter by arguing their client was simply stretching a facial muscle, reacting to a bad smell, or practicing for a community theater role. The case would ultimately rest on the testimony of the only true witness, the dog, who is sadly unable to take the stand and describe the emotional scars left by the encounter. Without a bark translator or a canine lie detector test, the whole process collapses into a farcical debate over human expressions and animal feelings that can never be empirically verified. This law, in its attempt to be kind, ends up creating a legal hall of mirrors where a citizen's guilt or innocence depends on the imagined emotional response of a creature that cannot speak for itself. But if you thought laws against frowning or off-key singing were difficult to enforce, wait until you try to define physical endurance behind the wheel. Our next stop takes us to the misty forests and rugged coastlines of Oregon, where state law draws a remarkably vague line in the sand. It is illegal to test your physical endurance while driving a car on a highway. This isn't a statute targeting street racing or distracted driving. It's a sweeping prohibition against any act of self-imposed physical challenge performed by the driver of a moving vehicle. The law's breathtaking lack of specificity transforms the passenger cabin of every car on an Oregon highway into a potential arena for illegal athleticism, provided anyone could actually figure out what that means. The immediate and hilarious problem with this law is its language. What precisely constitutes testing your physical endurance? The phrase is so broad and subjective that it could theoretically encompass a vast spectrum of behaviors, from the dangerously foolish to the utterly mundane. Is it testing your endurance to white-knuckle the steering wheel for an entire 100-mile trip without relaxing your grip? Is it an endurance test to deliberately avoid blinking for as long as humanly possible while staring at the yellow line of the highway? Could a particularly strict interpretation of the law see a driver ticketed for holding their breath through a long tunnel, or trying to see how long they can keep their leg elevated without touching the floor? The statute doesn't specify, creating a legal gray area where a police officer's personal interpretation becomes the law of the land, at least until a judge gets involved. This ambiguity reveals a fascinating, if unintended, commentary on the very nature of driving itself. Is driving not, in its own way, a test of endurance? A long road trip demands sustained focus, muscle control to maintain a steady speed and lane position, and the stamina to remain alert for hours on end. By this literal reading, every person who gets behind the wheel in Oregon is technically breaking the law the moment they embark on a journey longer than a quick trip to the grocery store. The law accidentally criminalizes the fundamental act of operating a motor vehicle for any extended period, turning every commuter and cross-country traveler into a de facto endurance athlete committing a moving violation. The most plausible origin story for this bizarre statute points toward a very specific and dangerous type of roadside daredevilry that likely prompted a single, frustrated lawmaker to act. Picture the 1960s or 70s, an era of muscle cars and a burgeoning culture of automotive machismo. It's not hard to imagine reports of reckless drivers engaging in stupidly dangerous stunts on the state's then new interstate system. Perhaps there was a trend of drivers attempting to see how long they could drive blindfolded, or how many miles they could cover using only their knees to steer while their hands were occupied with some other foolish task. The lawmaker, faced with this novel problem, didn't ban the specific stunts themselves likely because they couldn't imagine every possible iteration of human idiocy. Instead, they went for the broadest possible language, attempting to outlaw the entire category of behavior under the umbrella of endurance testing. It was a legislative Hail Mary, an attempt to stop a problem by making the very concept of the activity illegal. Of course, in practice, this law is nearly impossible to enforce with any consistency, and it likely exists today as a classic catch-all charge. A police officer who pulls over a driver for weaving between lanes might discover the person was in the middle of an impromptu seated meditation session or trying to see how long they could hold a yoga pose. The endurance test law gives the officer a convenient, pre-written violation to cite, even if the real issue was simple distraction or fatigue. It serves as a legal safety net, allowing law enforcement to address a genuinely dangerous situation. A driver who is not fully focused on the road, even if the specific behavior doesn't neatly fit into another category like reckless driving. It's a law that tries to legislate intent and state of mind, a nearly impossible task that results in one of the most wonderfully confusing statutes ever written, a testament to the government's eternal struggle to keep up with the inventive ways people find to be irresponsible. Leaving behind Oregon's vague prohibitions on automotive endurance, we arrive in Pennsylvania, where the state's fishing regulations display a stunning level of specificity. Here, the law is unequivocal. A fish is only considered legally caught if it is hooked in the mouth. Any fish brought to shore by means of a hook in its side, tail, or belly is not a valid catch and must be released. This isn't a suggestion or a guideline for ethical angling. It's a black and white legal definition that draws a very clear line between a sportsman and a poacher, all based on a few inches of anatomy. To understand the purpose behind this law, we need to look at the methods it was designed to prevent. The statute is a direct strike against two primary practices, snagging and foul hooking. Snagging involves using a weighted, treble-hooked lure and jerking it aggressively through the water not to entice a fish to bite, but to literally impale it anywhere on its body as it swims by. Foul hooking is a similar concept, often accidental, where a fish is hooked outside the mouth when it strikes near a lure but doesn't get the hooks in its jaws. The law makes no distinction between intent. The result is what matters. By outlawing any catch not hooked squarely in the mouth, Pennsylvania lawmakers effectively banned these unsporting techniques, prioritizing the skill of fooling a fish into biting over the brute force method of simply snatching it from the water. This legal precision is deeply rooted in the North American model of wildlife conservation, which holds that our fish and game are a public resource to be managed for all citizens. A key principle of that model is that hunting and fishing should be based on rules of fair chase. The idea is to give the animal a sporting chance, to make the pursuit a contest of wits and skill between the human and the prey. Snagging a fish eliminates that contest entirely. It turns fishing into mere collection. The Pennsylvania law enforces this ethical code with the force of statute, ensuring that the activity remains a sport governed by respect for the quarry, not just a harvest. It's a fascinating example of a state legislating not just conservation, but also the very morality of the hunt, insisting that how you catch the fish is just as important as whether you catch it. Of course, the enforcement of such a specific law presents its own set of challenges. A wildlife conservation officer patrolling a riverbank would need almost supernatural vision to determine the exact point of hook penetration on a fish still fighting in the water. The law truly comes into play at the moment of inspection when an angler's catch is checked. This creates a powerful honor system on the water where anglers must police their own behavior, knowing that a fish improperly hooked could result in a citation. It forces a level of self-awareness and immediate action, angling for a clean, mouth-hooked catch and being prepared to ethically release any fish that doesn't meet the strict legal standard. In this way, the law does more than just punish. It actively educates and shapes the behavior of an entire fishing community, elevating the practice from simple harvesting to a disciplined sport. Moving from the physical precision of Pennsylvania's fishing laws, we land squarely in the digital age with a statute that feels ripped from today's headlines. In Tennessee, the simple act of sharing your Netflix password isn't just a violation of a streaming service's terms of use. It's a specific crime against the state, potentially punishable as a felony. This law, passed in 2011, immediately captured national attention because it seemed to so perfectly encapsulate a modern dilemma, making criminals out of millions of college students, former partners, and generous parents across the state. But the true story behind this statute is far more complex than a simple war on password sharing. It's a fascinating case study of old laws straining to adapt to new technology and a state government's attempt to get ahead of a growing economic problem. To understand why Tennessee acted, it's crucial to recognize that this wasn't really about Netflix. The law was officially titled the Unauthorized Access Statute, and it was aimed at a much broader and more serious problem: the massive, organized theft of cable and satellite television services. For decades, the pay TV industry had been hemorrhaging billions of dollars a year due to signal theft, people using hacked cable boxes, illegal descramblers, or shared passwords to access premium channels without paying. This wasn't just a few friends sharing an HBO Go login. It was sophisticated criminal operations selling access to thousands of subscribers. The existing laws against theft of services were often analog-era statutes that didn't clearly cover the intangible nature of digital credentials. Prosecutors found it difficult to argue that sharing a string of letters and numbers constituted the same crime as physically tapping into a neighbor's cable line. Tennessee's legislation, heavily backed by the entertainment industry, sought to close that loophole. It updated the state's existing fraud statutes to explicitly include the theft of entertainment subscription services, defining it as knowingly and without permission using or sharing login credentials to avoid payment. The law's sponsor, a former federal prosecutor, argued it was necessary to protect the creative industries that are a major economic driver in the state, from Nashville's music scene to the film production hubs in Memphis. The statute was designed to give law enforcement a clear, modern tool to go after large-scale commercial pirates, not necessarily a grandparent letting their grandchild watch cartoons. However, the law's incredibly broad language is what caused the public outcry and cemented its place on lists of absurd laws. By making any unauthorized sharing a crime, it technically placed the casual, non-commercial sharing of a password, an act of commonplace digital generosity, on the same legal spectrum as organized fraud. The potential punishment, a Class C felony punishable by 3 to 15 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000, seemed wildly disproportionate to the crime of letting a friend binge watch a series. This created a terrifying dissonance, an act with no malicious intent and little to no financial impact on the company could, in theory, ruin a person's life. The law's true absurdity lies in its fundamental unenforceability at the individual level and its rapid obsolescence. It was a solution crafted for the world of cable TV, just as the streaming revolution was making that world obsolete. Netflix itself, the company whose name became synonymous with the law, initially had a relatively relaxed attitude toward password sharing, even joking about it on social media. Their business model was built on subscriber growth, and they understood that password sharing could act as a potent form of marketing, hooking viewers who might later get their own subscription. It wasn't until over a decade later, when their growth plateaued, that Netflix and other streamers began their own crackdowns, not by suing individuals, but by using technology to limit account access across multiple households. Tennessee's attempt to use the blunt force of criminal law to solve a problem that was ultimately a business model issue now stands as a curious relic, a well-intentioned but clumsy effort to legislate in a digital landscape that changes faster than any lawbook possibly can. But our next stop takes us to the heart of Texas, where the legal code addresses the age-old problem of theft with a specificity that could only come from the Old West. Here, it is explicitly illegal to milk another person's cow. At first glance, this seems like the most redundant law imaginable. Of course, it's illegal to take something that doesn't belong to you. But to dismiss it as mere common sense is to miss its true cultural significance. This statute isn't just about theft. It's a beautifully preserved fossil from a time when the line between survival and starvation could be measured in gallons of fresh milk, and a single act of poaching could spell disaster for a frontier family. To understand why such a specific law was necessary, we have to picture a 19th century Texas ranch. In an era before refrigeration and centralized dairy farms, a family's cow was far more than just livestock. It was a lifeline. It provided a daily supply of essential nutrients through its milk, which could be churned into butter or made into cheese, providing crucial calories and fat through harsh winters and dry seasons. For a homesteader, the loss of a day's milk or the stress on the animal from an unauthorized milking wasn't a trivial inconvenience. It was a direct threat to their well-being. A neighbor sneaking into your barn to relieve your cow of its milk wasn't just committing a petty crime. They were literally stealing food from your children's mouths. The law's specificity served as a powerful, unmistakable warning. This particular form of theft would be treated with the utmost seriousness because its impact was immediate and profound. The statute also speaks volumes about the nature of property rights on the frontier, where tangible goods held more value than abstract wealth. A law against theft is broad and can cover everything from a stolen pocket watch to a forged check. But a law against milking another man's cow is concrete, immediate, and universally understood by everyone in the community. There's no ambiguity. It doesn't require a jury to debate the value of the stolen property or the intent of the thief. The act itself is the crime. This kind of precise legal language was essential in a rough and tumble territory where courts were distant and law enforcement was sparse. It gave a sheriff or a judge a clear, unambiguous rule to enforce, cutting through complex legal arguments and delivering swift, tangible justice that everyone could understand. Furthermore, the law likely served a vital role in preventing conflict between neighbors. In tight-knit rural communities, an accusation of general theft could spiral into a bitter feud, but a specific statute provided a formal, legal outlet for grievance. Instead of a farmer suspecting his neighbor of stealing from him in various ways and letting resentment build, he could point to a clear violation of a specific code. The law acted as a pressure valve, allowing disputes to be settled in a courtroom rather than with a gunfight at the property line. It acknowledged the high stakes of rural life while simultaneously providing a civilized mechanism for resolving the tensions that life inevitably created. It's a perfect example of how the law can evolve to meet the very specific needs of a time and a place, serving not just as a deterrent but as a framework for maintaining peace in a potentially lawless land. Vermont, often celebrated for its progressive values and picturesque landscapes, holds onto a legal relic that tells a dramatically different story from its modern identity. In this state, a married woman is required by law to obtain written permission from her husband before she is allowed to wear false teeth. This isn't a whimsical or humorous oddity. It is a stark, chilling artifact of a not-so-distant past when women were legally considered the property of their spouses, their bodily autonomy entirely subject to a man's approval. The law reduces a basic medical device, essential for nutrition, health, and dignity, to the status of a frivolous purchase or accessory that a wife couldn't be trusted to manage on her own. To understand how such a statute could exist, we have to examine the legal doctrine of coverture, which governed marriage in America for centuries. Under this framework, upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was effectively covered by that of her husband. She couldn't own property, enter into contracts, sue or be sued, or keep her own wages. She was, in the eyes of the law, an extension of her spouse. This law about dentures is a direct and literal application of that principle. In the era it was written, any significant expenditure, even one for a clear medical necessity, required the husband's consent because he controlled all the finances. The law viewed false teeth not as a health aid but as a valuable commodity, a purchase of property. Since a wife couldn't legally make such a purchase on her own authority, the state mandated she get her husband's signed permission, treating her with the same legal standing as a child or an indentured servant. The breathtaking level of control this law sought to exert over a woman's body is what makes it so particularly jarring. It wasn't just about money. It was about a husband's dominion over his wife's physical presentation and well-being. A woman suffering from tooth loss, potentially in pain and unable to eat properly, would be forced to literally beg her husband for the right to alleviate her own suffering. This statute gave a man the legal power to dictate whether his wife could smile with confidence, chew her food effectively, or simply feel whole again. It weaponized medical necessity, turning it into a tool for domestic control and a constant reminder of a wife's subservient status. The law essentially framed a woman's mouth as her husband's domain, and any alterations to it required his express written authorization. From a modern constitutional perspective, this law is so flagrantly unconstitutional that it would be laughed out of any court in the country today. It violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees all citizens equal treatment under the law, a principle utterly eviscerated by this kind of gender-based classification. It also infringes upon fundamental rights to privacy and bodily autonomy, rights the Supreme Court has firmly established for decades. Any attempt to enforce it would be immediately and decisively struck down, a fact that every lawmaker and judge in Vermont undoubtedly understands. Which leads to the perplexing question, why is it still on the books? The answer is less about endorsement and more about the strange inertia of legal systems. State legislatures have limited time and political capital, and they prioritize repealing laws that are actively causing harm or are likely to be challenged. A law like this is considered dormant or symbolic. It's so obviously unenforceable that it poses no real threat, and spending official time and resources to repeal each one individually is often seen as a low priority. It remains as a ghost in the legal machine, a dusty paragraph that serves as a passive historical record of a time when the law itself was an instrument of systemic inequality. A time we've legally moved beyond, even if the ghost of that past still technically haunts the statute books. Our journey through legislative absurdity now takes a turn toward the psychological, landing us in Washington state, where the law takes a peculiar interest in the stories we tell about our families. Here, it is expressly illegal to falsely claim that your parents are rich. This isn't a simple prohibition against lying. It's a statute that zeroes in on a very specific type of social fraud, one that feels less like a felony and more like the kind of desperate boast you might hear in a high school cafeteria. The law's strangely juvenile focus makes it stand out from other fraud statutes, which typically target financial schemes or tangible losses. Instead, this regulation seems to police a form of emotional posturing, aiming its legal ire at the age-old human desire to appear more important or connected than we actually are. To understand why such a law might exist, we need to look past the playground and into the world of confidence games and social engineering. The most plausible explanation is that this statute was designed as a blunt instrument to combat a particular type of swindler, the kind who builds trust and credibility not on their own merits but on the borrowed fictional wealth of their family. Imagine a smooth-talking charmer arriving in a new town, weaving elaborate tales of a powerful, wealthy father back east. This invented lineage would immediately grant them a veneer of respectability and financial stability, making them seem like a safe bet for investment or a trustworthy partner for a business deal. They could use this fictitious pedigree to secure loans, gain entry into exclusive social circles, or defraud individuals who were impressed by their perceived connections. The law against pretending your parents are rich effectively cuts this con off at the knees, making the foundational lie itself a prosecutable offense even before any money changes hands. The breathtaking vagueness of the law is what truly pushes it into the realm of the absurd. What precisely constitutes rich in the eyes of the court? Is it a specific net worth, a certain annual income? Does it refer to old money, new money, or simply a perceived air of affluence? The statute offers no guidance, leaving it entirely up to a judge or jury to subjectively determine the financial status of people they have never met. The enforcement would be a logistical circus. Would the prosecution be required to call the defendant's actual parents to the stand to testify about their modest middle-class income? Would they need to enter into evidence bank statements and tax returns to prove the parents were, in fact, not wealthy? The entire case would devolve into a humiliating and deeply personal public dissection of a family's finances, all to prove the defendant was guilty of being a social climber. This leads to the law's most fascinating unintended consequence, its potential to criminalize a universal human foible. Who among us hasn't, at some point in our lives, exaggerated a family member's accomplishments or means to save face or impress someone? This statute technically turns a common social anxiety, the desire to fit in or be admired, into a matter for the police. A teenager telling tall tales to their friends, a young adult inflating their background on a first date, a salesman puffing up his pedigree to land a client. All of them could, under a ruthlessly literal interpretation of this law, be found guilty of a crime. It attempts to use the heavy hammer of the legal system to crack the very delicate nut of social insecurity, a tool so overpowered for the task that it threatens to shatter the concept of casual conversation itself. It stands as a bizarre monument to the government's occasional and deeply misguided attempt to legislate against vanity, forcing us to wonder where the line between a harmless fib and a prosecutable offense truly lies. Now, from the intricacies of family finances in Washington, we travel to a law that appeals directly to the stomach, landing us in America's Dairyland. In Wisconsin, it is considered a legal offense for a public restaurant to serve apple pie without cheese. This isn't a prohibition born from a desire to punish or restrict. Rather, It's a statute that functions as a state-sanctioned celebration, a deliciously weird homage to a regional identity so powerful it demanded a place in the legal code. To understand this law is to understand Wisconsin's profound, almost spiritual, connection to the dairy cow and the incredible bounty it provides. The origins of this quirky mandate are deeply woven into the fabric of Wisconsin's history and economy. In the 19th century, as settlers moved into the territory, they found a landscape perfectly suited for dairy farming, lush, rolling pastures and a climate ideal for growing feed crops for cattle. Immigrants from dairy-rich European nations like Switzerland, Germany, and Norway brought with them generations of cheese-making knowledge and tradition. This perfect storm of geography and expertise quickly established Wisconsin as a dairy powerhouse. By the early 20th century, the state was producing more cheese than any other, a title it still fiercely holds today. The apple pie without cheese law emerged from this culture of immense pride, a playful yet serious declaration that when in Wisconsin, you do things the Wisconsin way, and that means honoring the cheese. But this law is far less about enforcement and far more about endorsement. You will not find a task force of cheese police conducting sting operations on unsuspecting bakeries. Instead, the statute stands as the ultimate piece of culinary marketing, a permanent, state-funded advertisement for the local dairy industry. It's a powerful nudge, reminding both restaurateurs and customers of the proper, time-honored way to enjoy a classic dessert. The law essentially codifies a local preference into a point of cultural pride, ensuring that visitors and residents alike are exposed to what Wisconsinites believe is the pinnacle of the pie-eating experience. And who can blame them? The combination itself is a masterpiece of contrasting textures and flavors. A slice of warm, spiced apple pie, its filling sweet and slightly tart, finds its perfect partner in a cool, sharp, and salty slice of aged cheddar cheese. The creamy fat of the cheese cuts through the fruit's sweetness, while its savory notes provide a complex counterpoint that elevates the entire dish from a simple dessert to a sophisticated culinary event. This isn't some bizarre Wisconsin invention. The pairing dates back centuries in England and was a common treat in colonial America. Wisconsin's law simply refuses to let this perfect partnership fade into history, using the power of the state to preserve a delicious tradition. Ultimately, this statute is a love letter to cheese itself. It's a law that doesn't threaten, it recommends. It doesn't punish, it celebrates. In a legal landscape filled with bans and prohibitions, Wisconsin's approach is a refreshingly positive use of government power, one that promotes joy, supports local farmers, and safeguards a beloved cultural icon. It ensures that every time a menu in the state lists apple pie, it comes with an implicit invitation to experience a truly transcendent combination, a small but powerful testament to the idea that some things are just too good to be left to chance. Our exploration of peculiar statutes now brings us to the deeply solemn and quiet spaces of funeral homes, where the state of Georgia has drawn a very specific legal line in the sand. Here, it is a punishable offense to use profanity in the presence of a deceased person who is lying in a funeral home or coroner's office. This law immediately stands apart from general prohibitions against public swearing by virtue of its intensely specific context. It isn't concerned with curses hurled in a traffic jam or a heated argument on the street. Its sole focus is on protecting the dignity of the dead from the affront of foul language, creating a bubble of enforced civility around a corpse. The intent behind this statute is not difficult to decipher. It is a legislative effort to mandate respect and decorum during one of life's most vulnerable and sacred moments, the ritual of death. A funeral home is a place of profound grief, reflection, and solemnity for grieving families and friends. The presence of a dead body demands a certain hushed reverence, a cultural universal that crosses most societal boundaries. The law seeks to protect mourners from additional distress and to shield the deceased, who cannot defend their own honor, from any form of verbal desecration. It codifies a basic expectation of behavioral conduct, ensuring that even in the absence of personal empathy, there is a legal consequence for anyone who would shatter the fragile peace of a viewing room with a crude outburst. Yet, for all its noble intent, the law is mired in a quagmire of subjectivity that makes its practical application nearly surreal. The statute's power hinges entirely on the definition of a single, fluid term, profanity. What one person considers a harmless expletive, another might find deeply offensive. Is a heartfelt, tearful "damn it" muttered by a grieving spouse in a moment of anguished loss a violation? Would a funeral director casually remarking that a heavy casket is a real bitch to lift be committing a crime? The law provides no guidebook, leaving it to the discretion of individual law enforcement officers and judges to become arbiters of linguistic offense, a role for which they are spectacularly unqualified. This transforms a well-meaning law into a potential tool for selective enforcement, where the emotional state of the listener, not the intent of the speaker, could determine guilt or innocence. This leads to the almost insurmountable challenge of evidence. How does one prove such a violation occurred? Are there dedicated funeral home profanity officers stationed discreetly behind potted ferns? Would a coroner be expected to stop their work and take detailed notes on the language used by their assistants? The only witnesses to the crime would likely be the bereaved, who are in no state to participate in a legal proceeding, or other funeral home staff who might be reluctant to testify against a colleague or a client. The law feels less like a practical tool for maintaining order and more like a symbolic gesture, a statement of societal values carved into the legal code as a permanent reminder that some spaces should ideally remain beyond the reach of our coarsest instincts. It exists in a strange limbo, a law that is both perfectly understandable in its purpose and almost comically impossible to enforce, standing as a quiet monument to the hope that basic human decency can sometimes be legislated, even if only in theory. Our journey now takes us to the tropical paradise of Hawaii, where amidst the fragrant plumeria and crashing surf, the legal code holds a peculiar gem. It is expressly illegal to place coins in your ears. This law is a masterpiece of random specificity, a rule so bizarrely narrow that it immediately conjures a cascade of questions. What series of events could have possibly compelled a state legislature to dedicate time and resources to outlawing this particular form of numismatic accessorizing? The origins are shrouded in the island mists, but several theories offer a glimpse into the strange logic that might have been at work. The most plausible explanation points toward the serious crime of counterfeiting. In the early to mid-20th century, Hawaii's economy, heavily reliant on tourism and military presence, would have been uniquely vulnerable to counterfeit currency. Passing off fake coins would have been easier if they could be quickly palmed or switched. One can imagine a scenario where a cunning counterfeiter developed a method of concealing both real and fake coins in their ear canal during a transaction, allowing for a deft and unsuspected switch right under a cashier's nose. The law against placing coins in the ear, then, wouldn't be about the act itself, but about eliminating a potential tool of the trade for financial criminals. It was a preemptive strike, shutting down a suspected method of concealment before it could become a widespread problem. This theory transforms the statute from a silly joke into a strangely pragmatic, if incredibly niche, weapon in the fight against economic fraud. Alternatively, the law might be a direct response to a single, unforgettable individual, a charismatic street magician, or a particularly irritating busker whose signature trick involved pulling coins from his own ears and perhaps the ears of unwilling passers-by. While this might have been amusing at first, a local business owner or powerful lawmaker could have grown tired of the constant clinking and the disruption. If this performer was also using the trick to panhandle aggressively or distract tourists for pickpocketing schemes, the authorities might have sought a legal way to shut down his entire act. By making the foundational element of his routine, the placing of the coin, illegal, they could arrest him for preparation alone without needing to witness the full scam. This would be a classic case of a law written for one person, a legislative cannonball aimed at a single gnat. Then there is the simplest and perhaps most human explanation, pure, unadulterated personal pet peeve. Imagine a respected but notoriously stern territorial legislator in the early 1900s. This individual, perhaps a veteran with a low tolerance for frivolity, witnesses his own grandchild or a young sailor on leave foolishly sticking a penny in their ear. He finds it undignified, unhygienic, and emblematic of a broader decline in decorum. Fueled by this minor irritation, he uses his political influence to draft a bill against the practice, framing it as a matter of public safety or moral decency. His colleagues, not seeing any significant harm in the proposal and perhaps wanting to avoid a tedious argument over something so trivial, simply pass it through without objection to appease their esteemed colleague. The law then remains on the books for over a century, a permanent monument to one man's inexplicable irritation with a harmless, if odd, personal habit. The true charm of this Hawaiian statute lies in its magnificent pointlessness. There is no epidemic of coin-filled ears threatening the aloha state. Its enforcement is nearly unimaginable. Would officers patrol Waikiki Beach peering into the ears of sunbathers? Would a parent be cited for letting their child pretend to be a pirate with a couple of doubloons? The law exists in a state of peaceful dormancy, a perfect example of legal oddity that serves no clear purpose other than to remind us that for every possible human action, no matter how trivial, there might just be a law against it somewhere. But perhaps no law so perfectly blends the practical with the romantic as one nestled in the Statutes of Idaho. Here, the state legislature saw fit to dictate the very scale of affection, making it illegal for a man to give his sweetheart a box of candy weighing less than 50 pounds. This isn't a suggestion for a generous gift, it's a legal mandate for a grand romantic gesture, a requirement that turns a simple token of affection into a serious physical undertaking. One can only picture the scene, a hopeful suitor, not with a dainty heart-shaped box tucked under his arm, but staggering up the porch steps under the immense weight of a confectionery payload the size of a small piece of luggage. The most compelling explanation for this wonderfully strange law points directly toward economic protectionism. Idaho, particularly in the early 20th century when such a law might have been written, was a state built on agriculture. While it's famous for its potatoes, other crops like sugar beets and mint were also significant. Lawmakers, eager to support local industries, may have viewed this as a clever way to stimulate business for local candy makers, confectioners, and sugar refiners. By legally requiring a courtship gift to be of an industrial quantity, they were ensuring a steady, romance-driven demand for their products. A man couldn't just get by with a few penny candies from the general store. He was legally obligated to commission a monumental order that would keep a local candy kitchen busy for a week. It was less about the thought and more about the sheer economy-boosting tonnage. Beyond mere economics, the law reveals a fascinating and somewhat judgmental social commentary on the nature of courtship itself. This statute is a blatant legislative effort to discourage what was deemed cheap or insufficiently serious romantic behavior. It draws a very clear line in the sand, asserting that if a man's intentions are honorable and his affections genuine, they must be proven through a substantial financial and physical investment. A small box of chocolates could be a frivolous, impulsive gift for a casual flirtation, but a 50-pound crate signifies planning, effort, and serious intent. The law essentially weaponized the concept of courtship, using the state's power to ensure that romance met a certain minimum standard of demonstrative effort as measured on a bathroom scale. The practical realities of this law are where the true absurdity blossoms. First, there's the question of variety. What kind of candy could possibly fill a 50-pound box without becoming monotonous? Would it be a single gargantuan slab of peanut brittle, a vast ocean of identical chocolate creams? Then there's the issue of consumption. Is the sweetheart now legally obligated to accept this overwhelming tribute? And what is she expected to do with it? The gift borders on the impractical, potentially transforming a romantic evening into a community-wide effort to prevent the world's sweetest avalanche from spoiling in the pantry. It's a law that prioritizes the grand symbolic gesture over any sense of practicality, or indeed, the actual enjoyment of the gift itself, creating a surreal world where the path to a woman's heart is legally required to be paved with 50 pounds of sugar. Leaving behind the weighty romantic obligations of Idaho, we arrive in Illinois, home to perhaps the most frequently misunderstood law on our entire list. You've likely heard the shocking claim, in Illinois it is illegal to speak English. On its face, this sounds like a spectacular act of legislative insanity, a state turning its back on the nation's primary language. But the truth behind this infamous statute is far more nuanced and historically fascinating than the absurd modern myth it has become. This law wasn't a rejection of English. It was a temporary, pragmatic, and ultimately failed attempt to protect a specific European language from being stamped out by the relentless pressure of American assimilation. To understand this, we must travel back to the mid-19th century, a period of massive German immigration to the American Midwest. States like Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri saw an enormous influx of German speakers fleeing political turmoil and seeking economic opportunity. These immigrants didn't just bring their families, they brought their entire culture: newspapers, social clubs, churches, and schools where instruction was conducted exclusively in German. For these tight-knit communities, their language was the bedrock of their identity, the essential thread connecting them to their heritage. The idea was not to avoid learning English, but to ensure their children could also read, write, and understand complex subjects in their mother tongue while they gradually acquired English outside the classroom. The so-called illegal to speak English law is almost certainly a mangled reference to Illinois' infamous 1889 Edwards Law. This statute was not a ban on English, but rather a mandate for English. It required that the core subjects of all schools, both public and private, be taught exclusively in the English language. The law's primary target was these German-language parochial schools. To the German communities of cities like Chicago and Springfield, the Edwards Law was a direct and brutal assault on their culture. It wasn't making German illegal, it was making their entire educational system illegal unless it immediately abandoned German. The outcry was immediate and fierce. German Americans saw this not as an educational policy, but as an act of cultural suppression, an effort to forcibly anglicize their children and strip away a fundamental part of their identity. The political backlash was so powerful that it fundamentally altered the state's political landscape in the next election. The law became a single-issue rallying cry for the German community, who threw their support behind candidate John Peter Altgeld, who opposed the Edwards Law. Altgeld's victory led to the law's repeal just a few years after it was enacted. The myth that Illinois once outlawed English is a perfect historical inversion, a complete twisting of the facts. The real story is about a law that mandated English in an aggressive move to suppress another language, and the immigrant community that successfully organized to defeat it. The modern, absurd interpretation is a classic case of a law being stripped of its context, a whisper down, the Lane effect that turns a complex historical event into a simplistic and unbelievable punchline. It stands not as an example of legislative nonsense, but as a testament to the often overlooked power of immigrant communities to shape the laws of their new home and protect the cultural foundations they held most dear. Imagine, if you will, a young couple in a picturesque Iowa park, utterly lost in a moment of romantic bliss. The sun is setting, the world fades away, and their kiss stretches on, a perfect, timeless expression of affection. According to the law books of Iowa, however, this beautiful moment has a very strict expiration date. If that kiss lasts 1 second longer than 5 minutes, it officially crosses the line from a sweet gesture into a punishable offense. This bizarre statute stands as a truly heroic effort by lawmakers to impose a stopwatch on romance, to bring the cold, hard rule of law into the warm, fuzzy world of human connection. The roots of this 5-minute kiss cap almost certainly lie in the broader and much more common category of public indecency or disorderly conduct ordinances. For over a century, American towns and states have grappled with how to regulate public behavior to maintain what was once called the moral character of a community. These laws were often vague, prohibiting things like lewd or lascivious behavior, terms that were intentionally broad to give law enforcement wide discretion. Iowa's kiss law is a fascinating evolution of that concept, an attempt to take a subjective, emotionally charged act and distill it down to an objective, measurable standard. A city council, faced with complaints about amorous couples at the local lookout point or in public gardens, likely found the existing laws too ambiguous. How could a police officer prove something was lewd? It was a matter of opinion, but a clock is never wrong. By assigning a specific time limit, the law attempted to remove all ambiguity, creating a bright line between acceptable public affection and a crime. It was bureaucracy's answer to a problem of the heart. This leads us directly into the law's most glaring flaw, its breathtaking unenforceability. The practical mechanics of policing this statute are nothing short of comical. It implies a scenario where a police officer, presumably hiding behind a bush with a smartphone timer app at the ready, must intently watch a couple to determine the precise moment their lips first met. Does the timer reset for a quick breath or a whispered sweet nothing, or is it one continuous 5-minute countdown? The officer would then have to decide the exact microsecond to leap from the foliage and issue a citation, forever immortalized as the most romantic buzzkill in the state's history. The courtroom proceedings would be even more surreal, with the prosecution entering into evidence a time-stamped video of the kiss and the defense attorney arguing that their clients were merely engaged in a prolonged, stationary hug that involved occasional facial contact. The entire legal process would devolve into a humiliating and deeply invasive dissection of a private moment, all over a few extra seconds of affection. What makes this law so profoundly absurd, however, is its fundamental misunderstanding of human experience. A kiss isn't a unit of measurement, it's an expression of emotion. It can be a quick peck of greeting, a passionate declaration of love, or a tender, comforting gesture. Its meaning is derived from context and feeling, not from its duration. By trying to legislate this most personal of acts with a stopwatch, the government revealed a clumsy, almost childlike desire to control something that is inherently uncontrollable. It represents the ultimate form of regulatory overreach, where the state inserts itself not just into our public actions, but into the very tempo and rhythm of our most intimate connections. It's a law that attempts to quantify the unquantifiable, to bring order to the wonderfully chaotic world of human affection, and in doing so, it becomes a permanent monument to the often hilarious gap between the things lawmakers think they can control and the beautiful, messy reality of how people actually live and love. But if you think the government regulating the duration of a kiss is an overstep, wait until you hear what they've done with mouthwash in the Pelican State. Our next stop takes us to the humid, vibrant streets of Louisiana, where the legal code has taken a very firm stance on oral hygiene, specifically banning the act of gargling in any public place. This isn't a general noise ordinance, it's a brilliantly specific surgical strike against one particular activity, transforming a common bathroom ritual into a potential criminal act if performed outside the privacy of your own home. At first glance, this law seems to target a problem that doesn't really exist. Who, after all, is walking down Bourbon Street with a travel-sized bottle of Listerine loudly swishing away? But to dismiss it as mere legislative folly is to ignore the very real public health concerns that were likely its genesis. The most plausible origin story for this statute lies in the early 20th century fight against communicable diseases like tuberculosis, influenza, and the common cold. Doctors were beginning to understand how germs spread through saliva and airborne droplets, and public health campaigns were launched to encourage behaviors that minimized risk. Gargling, while a method to kill germs in one's own mouth, involves vigorously agitating a liquid which can aerosolize saliva and any pathogens it contains. A person gargling on a crowded streetcar or in a public market could, in theory, be creating a fine, infectious mist, inadvertently sharing their microbes with everyone in the immediate vicinity. The law, then, can be seen as a very targeted, if slightly clumsy, public health measure, an attempt to contain potential biological contamination by confining the act to a private sink. Beyond the germ theory, there's a powerful element of simple public decorum at play. Let's be honest, gargling is a bizarre and distinctly unattractive sound. It's a guttural, choking, glugging noise that is fundamentally at odds with the usual hum of civilized conversation. In a state like Louisiana, known for its incredible food, music, and vibrant public life, the law could be seen as an effort to protect the sensory experience of shared spaces. Imagine sitting at an outdoor cafe in the French Quarter, enjoying a bayonet and café au lait, only to have the moment shattered by the person at the next table performing a vigorous, open-mouthed gargle with their iced tea. The law protects citizens from this specific auditory and visual assault, defending the collective right to enjoy public areas without being subjected to the intimate and frankly gross bodily functions of strangers. It draws a legal line between what is acceptably public and what should remain private, placing gargling firmly in the latter category. The true absurdity of this law, however, is found in its breathtaking specificity and the near impossibility of its enforcement. It raises a host of logistical and philosophical questions that a New Orleans patrol officer would be forced to confront. What exactly constitutes gargling? Does a simple swish of water count, or does it require the signature head-tilted, back-bubbling action? Would aggressively chewing gum with one's mouth open be a violation? What about a singer warming up their vocals with a trill? The statute offers no guidance, leaving it to law enforcement to become arbiters of acceptable throat noises. Furthermore, how would one even prove the violation? The act is over in seconds. Without video evidence or a willing confession, a case would crumble instantly, making the law less of a practical tool and more of a symbolic statement about the kind of behavior a civilized society should expect from its citizens. It stands as a perfect, hilarious example of the law's occasional desire to micromanage human conduct, attempting to bring order to the chaotic symphony of public life by silencing one very specific and very odd instrument. And our tour of the absurd touches down next in the Pine Tree State, where Maine law takes a remarkably direct approach to aviation safety. The statute in question is a masterpiece of legislative clarity, making it a criminal offense for any person to step out of an aircraft while it is in flight. On its face, this seems like the most unnecessary law ever written, the legal equivalent of mandating that one should not use a flamethrower to light a birthday candle. Of course, you shouldn't jump out of a flying plane. It's a truth so self-evident that putting it into law feels almost like satire, a government-mandated reminder to not engage in spectacularly obvious acts of self-destruction. But to dismiss this statute as mere government redundancy is to miss a more compelling and pragmatic story. The most widely accepted origin of this law harks back to the barnstorming era of the early 20th century, a time when aviation was new, thrilling, and wildly unregulated. Daredevil pilots would travel from town to town, offering paying customers the adventure of a lifetime, a short flight in a rickety biplane. These aerial performers were known for their death-defying stunts, and part of the draw was the sheer danger involved. In this chaotic environment, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where a passenger, perhaps overcome by panic, confusion, or a misguided sense of adventure, might attempt to exit the aircraft before it had landed. The law acts as a final, non-negotiable line of defense against a single, catastrophic decision made in a moment of terror or foolishness. This is where the law reveals its true genius as a tool of legal liability. By making the act itself a crime, the state effectively shifts the responsibility entirely onto the individual. Imagine a tragic incident where a passenger does jump. Without this law, a slick lawyer might argue that the aircraft's door was faulty, the pilot was negligent for not installing a better lock, or the airline failed to adequately warn the passenger about the dangers of mid-air egress. The lawsuit could potentially bankrupt a small flight operation. However, with this statute firmly on the books, the defense becomes incredibly straightforward. Your Honor, our client is not at fault because the passenger chose to break a very specific and clearly written law. It's a legal shield protecting pilots and small aviation businesses from frivolous but financially devastating lawsuits by establishing an irrefutable standard of personal responsibility. The statute's breathtakingly simple language is also its most powerful feature. There are no exceptions, no clauses for altitude, and no distinction between a jumbo jet and a single-engine Cessna. It doesn't specify without a parachute because the act of stepping out is the crime, regardless of your intended method of descent. This creates a wonderfully absurd legal parity between a suicidal leap and a professional skydiver who simply forgets to file the correct paperwork. In the eyes of this particular law, they are one and the same. Both have committed the primary offense of exiting an aircraft in flight. The law is utterly uninterested in your plans after you break it. Its only concern is that you don't do it in the first place. It stands as a monument to the government's occasional need to state the obvious, not because its citizens are stupid, but because sometimes the obvious needs to be spelled out in black and white to protect everyone else from the one person who might just try it. Of all the laws we've encountered, this final entry might just capture the pinnacle of public safety legislation aimed at a problem that, for most of us, has never even crossed our mind. In the state of Maryland, the law is perfectly clear. You cannot take a lion to the movies. It's a statute that sounds like the punchline to a joke, but its origins are almost certainly rooted in a single, unforgettable incident that left a theater manager utterly terrified and a town council scrambling to ensure it would never, ever happen again. Picture the scene, a bustling main street in a Maryland town, perhaps in the early 1900s. The big story in the local paper isn't the news from Washington. It's the arrival of a spectacular traveling circus, complete with a menagerie of exotic animals. The star attraction is a magnificent African lion, a creature most people in the audience would have only ever seen in drawings. Now, imagine the lion's handler, a man whose entire life is spent on the road with these beasts. He's a performer, but he's also a caretaker, and perhaps he's grown a bit too comfortable with his formidable companion. After a long day under the big top, he wants nothing more than to unwind. He hears that the new moving pictures are showing at the town's theater, a fascinating new technology. In a moment of spectacularly poor judgment, he decides his lion deserves a night off too. After all, the big cat is tame, well-fed, and muzzled. What could possibly go wrong? The public safety concerns that this law so specifically addresses are both comical and entirely legitimate. First and foremost is the sheer primal terror a lion would inspire in a confined, dark space. A movie theater of that era was a cramped, crowded room where people are sitting shoulder to shoulder, their attention fixed forward. The sudden appearance of a 400-pound predator being led down the aisle would have caused absolute pandemonium. The ensuing stampede for the exits would have been more dangerous than the lion itself, likely resulting in injuries from trampling or crushed seats. Then there's the animal's reaction. Even a tame lion is a wild animal with instincts that can be triggered by the unexpected, a sudden loud noise from the film, the flickering images on the screen, or the scent of fear from the crowd. A startled lion, even muzzled, is immensely powerful and could easily knock over patrons, smash into the projector, or simply cause catastrophic damage by trying to flee the unfamiliar environment. Beyond the handler, this law also preemptively targets the era's eccentric wealthy elite, the kind of person who might have owned an exotic pet as a symbol of their status and whimsy. For such an individual, a social outing to the cinema might have seemed like the perfect opportunity to show off their latest acquisition, a pet lion cub on a diamond-studded leash. The law draws a very clear, non-negotiable line for this kind of privilege, stating that no amount of money or social standing permits you to turn a public venue into your personal safari lounge. It's a beautiful example of democratic equality. In the eyes of the law, a duchess and a circus hand are equally forbidden from bringing their pet lion to see the latest picture show. The true brilliance of the Maryland statute is its breathtaking specificity. It doesn't ban all exotic animals or even all big cats, it names the lion. This suggests the law was written as a direct response to an actual event involving one specific animal, effectively closing that exact loophole forever. It's a perfect snapshot of a moment in time, a law born from a single, spectacular act of poor judgment that was so shocking, so uniquely disruptive, that the government felt compelled to step in and state, for the record, that this particular brand of insanity would not be tolerated ever again. It stands as the ultimate testament to a universal truth of lawmaking. For every conceivable human action, no matter how seemingly improbable, there is probably someone somewhere who has already tried it. And so our wild ride through America's legislative funhouse comes to an end. A journey that has taken us from donkeys in bathtubs to 50-pound boxes of candy. What a spectacularly bizarre tapestry these laws weave, a collection of rules so specific, so strangely earnest, that they couldn't possibly have been dreamed up by even the most imaginative satirist. Yet they are real, each one a tiny, frozen moment in time, a legal fossil preserving the fears, values, and wonderfully peculiar priorities of the communities that enacted them. These statutes are far more than just jokes. They are unexpected windows into the American soul, revealing a constant, often comical, tug-of-war between order and chaos, between the desire to control every conceivable outcome and the beautiful, unpredictable messiness of human nature itself. Think about the impulses behind them. Some were born from pure, unadulterated panic, a desperate attempt to legislate against a future that seemed terrifying and unknown, like California's law against driverless cars speeding. Others were crafted from a deep, if quirky, sense of moral conviction, an effort to enforce public decorum or protect the vulnerable, whether it was the dignity of the deceased in Georgia or the emotional well-being of Oklahoma's dogs. And then there are those that seem to have sprung from a single, legendary act of such stunning oddity, like someone actually taking a lion to the movies, that the town council simply had to ensure it was never, ever repeated. Together, they form a parallel history of the United States, one written not in grand treaties and speeches, but in the small, strange, and wonderfully human stories of people trying to solve problems that the rest of the world didn't even know existed. This is where the conversation turns to you. The truly amazing thing is that this list is just the beginning. For every absurd law we've uncovered, there are dozens more hiding in the statute books of your own state, your own county, your own hometown. They are waiting to be discovered, each with its own story to tell. So we want to hear from you. What is the weirdest, most hilarious, or most head-scratching law from where you live? Have you ever heard a local legend about why it was passed? Jump down into the comments and share your favorite find. Let's build the ultimate list of American legal oddities together. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's forgotten corners, then you're in the right place. This channel is dedicated to unearthing the stories that fell through the cracks, the fascinating truths that are stranger than fiction. So make sure you hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications. We've got so many more incredible journeys into the past planned, and we don't want you to miss a single one. Thanks for joining us on this tour of the utterly absurd. Until next time, keep your donkeys out of the bathtub, your ice cream cones out of your pockets, and never stop being curious about the wonderfully weird world around you.